G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here, with Australia's Day of National Shame, book reading of Darwin 1942, Australia's Darkest Hour by Timothy Hall, based on the proceedings and findings of the Low Royal Commission into the Bombing of Darwin, which happened on the 19th of February 1942. This chapter is called the Brisbane Line, which many people, me included, used to think was an imaginary strategic defensive line running from just north of Brisbane, in the pink highlighter I've got it 100 miles north of Brisbane, running down to just north of Adelaide. However, in this book, the documentary historical record, what came out of the War Council and the War Office, it refers to, quote, the vital Brisbane-Melbourne line. So what we're talking about is just north of Brisbane, to just sort of west of Melbourne. Okay, let's get on with the history. As dusk fell on the smouldering town, there was a general feeling of acute depression. Nobody doubted that the Japanese would be back next morning with an even heavier bombardment, or worse, with an invasion force. They might even come under cover of darkness that night, landing silently further down the coast and approaching Darwin from inland to trap them like rats. There had been a moment of panic in the late afternoon when two Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had appeared over the horizon, coming in very high from the northwest. The sirens had wailed their warning and the guns had opened up, but either the planes were too high or the gunners' aim too shaky, and the shells had burst harmlessly far below the aircraft. They had circled the town lazily a couple of times and flown off without attempting to inflict further damage. In the ruins of the police station, Sergeant Bill McKinnon gloomily reviewed the options with 5 exhausted colleagues, and, more from wishful thinking than from anything else, they agreed that they would probably be evacuated that night. In the officers' mess at Larrakia Barracks there was uncertainty as well as apprehension. It came ironically from the fact that the barracks had come through the raid almost untouched. Even the hospital had received a heavier battering. Far from being reassured by this reprieve, the officers wondered if the Japanese had deliberately left the barracks undamaged so that they would be available for their own troops. Giving support to this gloomy notion were the stories that were circulating about how the Japanese had also ignored vital installations on the harbour, not attempting to attack such obvious targets as the fuel tanks, the water supply, or even the floating dock. Katoomba, in the dock, had fought off the dive bombers with great courage, but nobody really doubted that if the Japanese had wanted to, they could have destroyed them both. The clear implication was that they also meant to leave these undamaged for their own use after the landing. Captain Bernard Coleman of the Provost Corps was cheering nobody up by reasoning aloud that if the Japanese landed at Broome, the Australians in Darwin would be cut off, and if they made a frontal attack on Darwin, they would have something worse than a 1 in 5 chance of getting out alive. The junior officers waited for example and leadership, but it was sadly lacking, and nobody seemed to know what was going to happen. In the naval mess, a junior officer called Zelman Cowan, a young lawyer and a Rhodes Scholar, listened while the senior officers discussed the invasion, which all agreed was inevitable. It was, the future Governor-General recalled, peculiarly gloomy talk. And indeed, as the army moved out a few hours later, and as reports came in of the bolt to the south by those civilians who might have been expected to set an example, there was precious little for comfort. Later, Cowan remarked, quote, "Overall, and even allowing for our comparatively small national resources in the face of a powerful and well-prepared enemy, we did very poorly in preparing for an anticipated happening, about as poorly as we could have done. And acts of individual courage and dedication to duty that day cannot obscure the fact that it was a bad day for Australia," unquote. There were the inevitable post-mortems. Why did the government care so little about the fate of Darwin and the people trapped there? Captain Edward Thomas, the senior naval officer in Darwin, had no illusions that the town could withstand an attack or an invasion by the Japanese. Quote, "In my opinion, it would be taken by the enemy," he said. and if it were taken, the losses would be very heavy and probably total among the men and materials on the peninsula of Darwin. I would expect about 1,200 naval personnel and 3,000 military personnel, that means army, to be lost, as well as more than 1,000 RAAF personnel. So in the eyes of the Navy, the RAAF were not proper military personnel. They did run away from the airfield, and 90,000 tonnes of fuel, unquote. What was more, there were still over 1,300 civilians trapped in Darwin who were only there because the government had been so dilatory in evacuating them. Curtin's, that's the Prime Minister, Curtin's public speeches rang with exhortations to Australians to, quote, gird our loins and steel our nerve, unquote, to protect the country. After the raid on Darwin, although playing down the damage that had been inflicted, he warned Australians to be prepared to face the enemy on their home soil. Quote, doing this is no petty local defence, he urged them. It is of major strategical importance to the total war. The enemy knows that failure to hold Australia means the ultimate offensive against him becomes more difficult. Hence his haste to get in quickly. Hence the double urge on us to prevent this happening, unquote. They were brave words, but on the northern battlefront where this struggle was already being fought, nothing was done. 3 weeks after the raid, Group Captain Frederick Scherger was saying that the position was actually worse, if that were possible, than on the day of the raid. There were still no fighters, the only hope that Australians had of resisting the Japanese. And no additional guns had been sent. In addition, little of the damage had been repaired, and the wharf was still out of commission. So for one of my subs was asking how the looters were possibly shipping their stolen property out of Darwin when the wharf had been destroyed. At that time, a lot of ports in Australia and elsewhere in the world, they used barges and lighters. And anything that weighed less than about 5 tonnes would be put on the bottom of a flat-bottomed rowing boat, and it could be taken off the beach, rowed out to the ship and lifted up by the ship's donkey engine and its cranes. The most popular scenario was that the Japanese would not make a frontal attack on Darwin and expose themselves to what little defences there were, but would come ashore in 70 to 100 amphibious craft somewhere between Wyndham and Daly River. They would then strike inland for a comparatively short distance to sever the vital lines of communication to Darwin, the railway and the north-south road. Once these were secured, the whole Darwin Peninsula would be at their mercy, and with long-range aircraft operating from one of the air bases in the area, they could move down the existing lines of communication and fan out throughout Australia. Happily for the Australians, the Japanese didn't have the soldiers or the boats to do it with. The months and years of neglect, of always sending Darwin old and decrepit equipment, of always maintaining that essential equipment was never available or could not be spared, were now exacting their toll. Looking back, it seems almost incomprehensible that Darwin was left so exposed and so neglected, not only in the weeks and months immediately before the raid when it was clear that a Japanese attack of some kind was inevitable, but even during the weeks after the attack, when a Japanese landing seemed almost inevitable. In spite of the pleas by the defence chiefs that there was no equipment that could be released for Darwin, there were guns and fighters available. Certainly there were not many, but there were enough to rush to a part of the country that was threatened with immediate invasion and on which the very survival of the nation depended. Was some other factor at work besides the simplistic and not very convincing one that Australia was in the hands of men who were incompetent, Abbott, and who failed to realise the desperate straits in which Darwin was now placed? It is indeed possible that a deliberate part of Australian strategy at that time was that Darwin should not be given any aid, and that all Curtin's talk was political posturing? Is it possible that Darwin was the first and most grievous casualty of that rather shadowy policy of war known as the Brisbane Line? politicians have understandably tended to push the very existence of the Brisbane Line into the same basket as wyverns, rocks, hippogriffs and other mythical creatures, to be dragged out from time to time and dusted down for political amusement. It would be hard for them to do otherwise with a policy that would have deliberately surrendered 7/8 of the Australian continent to the Japanese so that the other 1/8 could have a chance of surviving. Considering that Australia is indefensible against any enemy determined to make a landing at some remote part of its 36,700 kilometre coastline, and that in her immense empty spaces the handful of inhabitants could not offer even a token resistance, it would not be surprising if a strategic plan existed for protecting at least as much of the continent as possible. And this, by definition, implies that the rest would have to be abandoned. There was just such a plan as this, which involved falling back behind an imaginary line that ran just north of Brisbane to just north of Adelaide, which became known as the Brisbane Line. No politician who wanted to keep the vote of those unfortunate enough to live on the wrong side of that line, or those who believed in the myth that Australia could be defended against all comers, would want to be associated with a party that even countenanced such a plan, and so for years its very existence was denied. The way Tony Abbott would put it these days, operational matters can't discuss. That the Brisbane Line did exist, however, is hardly disputed today. Indeed, Prime Minister John Curtin publicly acknowledged in 1943 that when General Sir Ivan Mackay was appointed General Officer Commanding Home Forces by the Menzies government, with responsibility for organising Australia's defences, one of his first proposals after Japan entered the war was that there should be what he called the Brisbane Line. Menzies and his short-lived successor Arthur Faddens had been in opposition for 4 months when the colourful and often outrageous Eddie Ward, then a member of Curtin's cabinet, found out about the Brisbane Line and decided to make capital out of it. He accused the Menzies government, quote, "these patriots," unquote, as he sarcastically called them, of formulating a plan, quote, "for abandoning the whole of Australia without the firing of a single shot," unquote. The opposition denied that such a plan had ever existed, and Curtin, deciding that this was neither the time nor the occasion for making a political issue of it, tried unsuccessfully to silence the ebullient Eddie Ward. When this failed, he conceded that there had indeed been such a plan proposed by General Mackay, but that it had been rejected out of hand as soon as it was put up. It had never existed at all, he said. It was a lie. Though Eddie Ward died in 1963 without ever being able to prove it. Mackay had indeed put up the idea of the Brisbane Line. In a recommendation to the Advisory War Council, he wrote, quote, "we should at once determine which portions of Australia it would be vital to hold in the event of a Japanese invasion. The most vital area is Port Kembla, Sydney, Newcastle, Lithgow area, to which must be added Brisbane, because it's now an important place for US forces, and Melbourne, the latter in view of its economic and military importance." Right? Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne. All other places must be regarded as isolated localities. As regards Tasmania and Townsville in particular, no attempt should be made while the main area remains equally threatened to defend with more troops than are in those areas now, unquote. This was little more than a token force of conscripts. Mackay wrote this not to Menzies, as Curtin maintained, but on the 4th of February 1942, when Curtin himself had been Prime Minister for 4 months. It was no wonder that he was so anxious to silence the loquacious Eddie Ward, his own minister. It was not only Mackay who supported the idea of what the War Council addendum calls, quote, "the vital Melbourne-Brisbane line," unquote. The Chief of the General Staff, Lieutenant General Sir Vernon Sturdee, went even further. The problem in Sturdee's mind, as War Council was told, quote, "is not what we can move out of this vital area to protect, say, North Queensland, Tasmania or Western Australia, but whether we should not now take, bracket, the few troops which are already there, close bracket, away from those areas to increase our strength at the decisive place, unquote. The Minister for the Army, Francis Michael Ford, summed up the enormity of Mackay and Sturdee's proposal. Quote, "The considerations put forward by the General Officer Commanding Home Forces and the Chief of General Staff," he told the War Cabinet, "necessitating the concentration of defence on the vital Melbourne to Brisbane line and leaving the balance of Australia more or less to depend upon its meagre existing defences without reinforcements against whatever attack might be opposed to it, are deeply disturbing." Unquote. The politicians decided that it was unacceptable to adopt such a concept as a matter of recorded policy. But Mackay and Sturdee were writing about a policy they both favoured, and they were, after all, the two senior soldiers in Australia. What was more, they were writing only a fortnight before the raid on Darwin. The final confirmation that this was indeed the policy being followed by the officers responsible for the defence of Australia comes not from Australia, but from London. Rule Britannia. In an appreciation of the defence of Australia, written at about the same time, the British Chiefs of Staff, bracket, who believed that an attack on Darwin was imminent and would be followed shortly afterwards by one on Fremantle, Western Australia, close bracket, reported that their Australian counterparts, bracket, that is, Sturdee among others, close bracket, agreed with them, quote, "that the area in Australia vital to the continuance of our war effort lies on the east and south coast, generally between Brisbane and Melbourne," unquote. It was General Douglas MacArthur and some of his senior officers who unwittingly disclosed that, far from being rejected, the Brisbane Line was a firm reality when General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Australia to become Supreme Commander South West Pacific Area. MacArthur discovered that the defence plan for ensuring the safety of Australia involved the concept of Northern Australia being taken by the enemy and of Australians falling back to defensive positions along the Brisbane Line. This defeatist plan took account of the fact that most service personnel stationed in Australia were second best, and that the cream of Australian youth was fighting a war thousands of kilometres away, and that there were no airfields, few aircraft, and serious shortages of essential war supplies. The Western Australians, Egan VB Ed, although they did not know it, were exactly right when they complained that they were a forgotten people. The strategy did not even make provision for them to retreat behind the Brisbane Line. At Tokemwall on the Murray River in New South Wales, a £3 million airbase was built that was only ever used for training. After the arrival of MacArthur, and without making any contribution to the war effort, it was dismantled and its buildings sent to other air stations all over Australia. The Commonwealth Auditor-General was highly critical of blundering and wasteful expenditure, but what he was never told was that Tokemwall was built to maintain and service aircraft defending the Brisbane Line. What is even more pertinent is that Tokemwall had been built for this purpose, not by the previous government, but by Curtin himself, the man who insisted that he had never heard of it and that he would never have countenanced such a treacherous plan. The evidence is irresistible that the Brisbane Line strategy, by whatever name, was very much the key to Australia's defence policy at the time of the Darwin raid. Curtin, after all, had only been in power for 135 days before the raid, and in that time had built Tokemwall. This being the case, there was never any possibility of Darwin being given the reinforcements it needed, and all Curtin's fine words about fighting to defend every corner of Australia were nothing more than words. It was assumed that the Japanese were now on the point of invading, and that if this happened, they would overrun the Defence Forces and capture or destroy any reinforcements that were sent north. Darwin, like the West Australian ports that were bombed soon afterwards, was therefore considered expendable. Even the man who had conceived the idea of the Brisbane Line, General Sir Ivan Mackay, was still in command of all land forces in Australia at the time of the raid. The Brisbane Line policy was finally abandoned on the 18th of April 1942 when MacArthur became Supreme Commander, and by the 25th of April there were so many fighter aircraft at Darwin that when a Japanese attack force of 25 bombers and 10 fighters came over, 8 bombers and 4 fighters were shot down. Although Ward's motives in first making a political issue out of the Brisbane Line and then sticking to it like a limpet for years were usually questioned, there was no denying the truth of at least one statement he made when he remarked, quote, "Nothing could be more conducive to undermining the morale of the nation than the completely defeatist plan which envisaged the sacrifice of large portions of the nation and the adoption of the Brisbane line of defence. In particular, it would have shocked the confidence and caused the complete loss of hope of those living in areas which were to be given to the Japanese." Unquote. It was because MacArthur saw it in the same way that he ordered the Brisbane Line strategy to be abandoned immediately. From that point, he said, Australia would have an aggressive, positive policy that was offensive rather than defensive. He evolved his own plan for fighting the battle for Australia in the strategic islands to the north, a bold plan that involved moving the front line gradually northwards. Eddie Ward claimed in Parliament that evidence of the existence of the Brisbane Line had been lost when a map and all the detailed information had been improperly removed from the official file. Ward had intended to embarrass only the opposition, but it reflected almost as badly on his own leader, John Curtin, who had just obtained a knighthood for the head of the Defence Department, whose file it was that Ward was now alleging had been tampered with. A royal commission was appointed to determine whether Ward's accusation was warranted. A judicial sledgehammer to crack a very small political nut if ever there was one. And by a nice coincidence, the Royal Commissioner was Mr Justice Lowe, who had sat as Commissioner at the Darwin Inquiry. The barrister who appeared for Ward was John Barry KC, the counsel who had assisted Lowe at Darwin. The hearing developed into a farce, with Ward claiming parliamentary privilege and refusing to give evidence, and the Commission, without much evidence to support it, ruling that the quote missing unquote map had probably never existed. There was a special irony in the fact that it was Ward who was now championing the needs of Darwin. Just before the war, he delivered an impassioned speech in Parliament, arguing that Australia was in less danger from foreign aggression than at almost any time in history, and he had then opposed the expenditure of £20,000 for strengthening Darwin's defences. The official war history confirms the belief of many strategists that Major General Blake's tactics were unsound, whether or not the Brisbane Line strategy was the cornerstone of the defence policy. He had more than 20 units deployed around the coast in the immediate area of Darwin and fixed defences of exactly 10 guns. The shortage of guns was not his fault, but his deployment of the units meant that he could only counterattack if the Japanese were obliging enough to land in the area where they were positioned. There's another half that chapter to come, but that's 23.5 minutes, so I'll call an end to this one here. The Brisbane to Melbourne vital line, eh? Not Brisbane to Adelaide, Brisbane to Melbourne. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.